I leave the entire Harper estate, including all commercial holdings, valued at $42 million, to my eldest son, Richard Harper. The lawyer's voice cracked through the oak-paneled room like a gavel. My brother leaned back in his Italian leather chair, lips curling into a smile that had haunted me since childhood. He smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit and tapped his gold pen against Dad's desk, the desk that was already his in every way that mattered. Mom's hands twisted in her lap, her face pale but unreadable. My uncle shifted near the window, staring out at the rain-streaked parking lot. And me? I sat frozen, waiting for my name, waiting for something that didn't feel like a punchline. And to my son, Daniel Harper. The lawyer continued, pushing his glasses higher as if he doubted the words himself. I leave the Marigold, my 1989 fishing boat, currently docked at Westport Marina, slip number 9. The silence was brutal. Even the hum of the lights above seemed to stop. Then Richard broke it with a laugh that rattled every inch of the office. Not a chuckle, not even a snicker. A laugh sharp enough to cut skin. "At least you got something, Danny," he said, turning those smug eyes on me. "Maybe you can fish for dinner when you can't pay rent." Heat rose in my chest, but before I could speak, my daughter Emily stood. 16, fierce as a storm, her voice didn't waver. "Grandpa always said value isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in meaning." Richard rolled his eyes. "Then that boat means Dad thought your father was worthless." But he didn't know Dad. Not the way I did. No one in that room did. My father wasn't a man of accidents. He planned everything, down to the brand of coffee he drank and the paper clips he used in his office. If he left me a boat, while leaving Richard $42 million in properties, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. That night, as I stood at slip number 9 staring at the rust-stained hull of the Marigold, I felt the weight of my family's judgment pressing down. The boat looked like junk, but when I stepped on deck and opened the storage hatch, my breath caught. Hidden beneath tarps and tools wasn't just fishing gear. It was files, blueprints, contracts, deals my father had been working on quietly, away from Richard, away from everyone. And on top of it all, a handwritten note. "Daniel, real strength doesn't come from what you inherit. It comes from what you build. This is your foundation. Build wisely." Dad. That night, I realized my father hadn't left me scraps. He'd left me a legacy, one Richard could never touch. Not millions in real estate, but the chance to rise on my own, to prove that my hands, scarred, calloused, and unpolished, were capable of building something greater than his empire. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 39 years old, and this is the story of how a fishing boat no one wanted became the key to everything my father believed I could be. Honest work, Dad would call it whenever someone asked about his younger son's line of work, though his voice always carried more defense than pride. It sounded less like admiration and more like an explanation. Why Charles Harper, the man who turned a single foreclosed duplex into a sprawling fortune, had a son who worked by the hour, overtime pay included. Charles Harper wasn't just wealthy. He was a story people told over dinner tables and in barber shops. In 1974, he scraped together every cent he had to buy a crumbling duplex for $11,000. He patched the roof himself, painted the walls, fixed plumbing at night after his shifts at the mill. By the time I was born in 1985, he owned 30 rental properties. By the time I graduated high school, the Harper name was stamped on office towers, shopping centers, and apartment complexes across half a dozen states. Life in our house was like living in a theater where the lead actor had already been cast, and I was just another face in the wings. Richard, my brother, was 4 years older and every inch the heir apparent. Mom hung his perfect report cards on the fridge with gold star stickers. Mine got lost under dentist reminders and grocery lists. At dinner, Dad would push a folded newspaper across the table and announce, "Look at Richard finalizing that office park deal. 26 years old and already overseeing 10 properties. That's vision." Meanwhile, I was pouring concrete for someone else's dream, coming home with sore shoulders and cement dust on my boots, while Richard strolled into the country club in polished wingtips and cufflinks. I never hated my work, though. I loved it. There's something about construction, something honest. When you pour a foundation, either it holds or it doesn't. No marketing tricks, no spin, no spreadsheets to make the numbers prettier. Just truth, set in stone. Emily, my daughter, understood that better than anyone. She was born 2 weeks after her mother walked out. Deciding marriage to a man who built houses with his hands didn't shine bright enough. Emily became my anchor, my compass. Every other week she lived with me, and those weeks carried me through everything else. Dad, you make things that last, she'd remind me whenever she caught me staring too long at another newspaper article about Richard. Uncle Richard just sells what's already there. You create from nothing. That's worth more. But even Emily couldn't hide her confusion when we filed into Jonathan Miles's office 2 weeks after Dad's funeral. The cancer had cut him down fast. 1 month he was shaking hands over million-dollar contracts. The next he was gone. Richard handled the service, turning it into what felt like a corporate mixer instead of a farewell. Mom, draped in black, seemed to shrink inside herself, tissues clutched in her lap. Before the reading started, she leaned close and whispered, "Your father never did anything without a reason, Daniel. Even when it didn't make sense to the rest of us, he always had a reason." Uncle Thomas stood apart, by the window, staring down at the wet asphalt below. He and Dad had started together once, 2 brothers with nothing but grit and a borrowed hammer. They built their first houses side by side. But somewhere in the early 90s, something cracked. One day Thomas was Dad's right hand in Harper Development. The next, he walked away, starting his own small contracting outfit across town. He still came to birthdays, still sent cards at Christmas, but the air between him and Dad always carried the weight of a sentence never spoken. Jonathan Miles cleared his throat, arranging the papers before him like he was bracing for the storm he knew was coming. Charles Harper was very deliberate in his instructions, he said, eyes flicking up to measure us before continuing. And as the words that would split our family in 2 began to leave his mouth, I felt Emily's hand slip into mine beneath the polished table. That was the moment I understood, whatever Dad left behind, it wasn't going to be what anyone expected. There are no provisions for appeal. What I'm about to read is final and legally binding. Jonathan Miles's voice echoed against the walls of his office, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, as if all the air had been drawn out and replaced with a heavy silence. Richard leaned forward in his chair, eyes gleaming like he was already signing checks and calculating returns. I sat stiffly in my one good suit, the same suit I'd worn at high school graduation, wondering why Dad had insisted I be here at all. Humiliation settled on me heavier than any cinder block I'd ever carried. I'd been hit by falling beams, had hot tar eat through my gloves, even broken ribs when scaffolding gave way on a Pittsburgh job site. None of it compared to this, sitting helpless while $42 million in assets slid neatly into Richard's hands, and I was left with a boat worth less than most people's used cars. Richard couldn't resist twisting the knife. He stood, walked over to me, and clapped my shoulder with mock compassion. "Hey, Danny, if you need gas money, just ask. Family helps family. Maybe that old boat still floats. You could start a little charter business. Hell, I'd even invest, give you a small loan to get started." His smile was poisonous, his cologne sharp enough to sting. Jonathan cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. "If there are no further questions, we can proceed to signatures." "No questions," Richard said quickly, pulling a Mont Blanc from his pocket. "Everything seems perfectly clear." Dad knew exactly what he was doing. The next morning, I drove out to Westport Marina. The guard at the gate gave me a look I couldn't quite place, something between pity and curiosity, when I told him I was there to see my inheritance. "Slip 9, he said, waving me through. "Though I should tell you, your dad hasn't taken her out in at least 5 years. Just sits there." And there she was at the end of the dock, looking like a relic of better days. The Marigold, a 28-foot fishing boat from 1989. The paint peeled in wide strips, gull droppings spattered across the deck, ropes sagging like they'd given up. The vinyl seats were sun-bleached and cracked, the metal railings spotted with rust. She looked tired, forgotten. Harold, the marina manager, strolled over with a styrofoam cup in hand. He'd been working these docks longer than I'd been alive, gray hair peeking from under his cap. "Your dad loved this boat," he said, resting his weight against a piling. "Came down here every Sunday till about a year ago when the cancer got worse. Strange thing, though, he never took her out anymore. Just sat in the cabin, writing in that notebook of his, or staring at the water. Guess he liked the quiet." I climbed aboard, the deck groaning faintly under my boots. Harold sipped his coffee and added, almost casually, "Your brother was down here yesterday. Took pictures, said he could help you list it. Even offered me 10 grand on the spot. Said he'd turn it into some kind of planter for one of his developments." The thought of Richard gutting Dad's boat and using it as decoration for a strip mall made my stomach twist. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the ownership papers spread in front of me. The title felt like a cruel joke. My phone buzzed, and Mom's voice came through, gentle but steady. "Daniel, don't let bitterness take root," she said. "Your father saw something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself." "Yeah," I muttered, staring at the cracked photo of the marigold I'd taken earlier. "He saw someone worth about $8,000. "That boat wasn't about money," she replied firmly. "Your father bought it with his first real paycheck from the mill. Long before the company, before the properties, before Richard was winning awards and shaking hands with bankers. That boat was his dream, his escape. He took you out on it when you were little, remember? Back before life got so complicated. Before everything became about deals and numbers." Her words pressed against a part of me I'd kept locked away. I did remember. The smell of salt air. Dad's laugh carrying over the waves. His rough hand guiding mine as I held the wheel, whispering, "Feel that, Danny? That's freedom." And for the first time since the will was read, I realized maybe the old marigold wasn't the end of my father's story for me. Maybe it was the beginning of something he'd always wanted me to find. I didn't remember those trips. Or maybe I'd buried them on purpose, the way I'd buried every other memory from before Richard became the golden heir to the Harper fortune. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from him. A photo filled the screen. He was leaning back in Dad's old chair, feet kicked up on the desk, holding a bottle of champagne. The caption read, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown. But somebody's got to do it. Let me know when you're ready to part with the boat. 10 grand still stands." I stared at it until my hands shook with something between rage and humiliation. Later, Emily found me in the garage, sitting on the cold concrete floor surrounded by boxes of Dad's old photographs and papers, digging for a reason, a clue, anything that might explain why he'd done this to me. "You going to sell it?" she asked quietly, sliding down beside me. "The boat?" I exhaled. "Might as well. Transmission's gone on the truck, and Richard's offer would cover the repairs. Maybe even leave me a little extra." She picked up a faded photo from one of the boxes. Dad stood on the deck of the marigold, arm wrapped around a boy with wild hair and a grin too big for his face. Me. Both of us looked like we'd just found buried treasure. Grandpa never did anything without thinking it through 10 times, Emily said, brushing the dust off the frame. "Remember when he gave me that old compass for my 10th birthday? Everyone thought it was junk. Turned out it was his father's from World War II. Guided a bomber crew through 37 missions. He told me, sometimes the smallest gifts carry the biggest stories." 3 days later, I decided to take the marigold out once before listing it. Selling her without ever touching the water felt wrong, like throwing away a letter without reading the words inside. If Dad had kept that boat all these years, I figured I at least owed him one final trip. The October morning was sharp and clear, sunlight glinting across the harbor like glass. The marina smelled of salt and fuel, gulls crying overhead. Harold, the manager, met me at the slip. His cap was pulled low, coffee steaming in his hand. "Engine should run fine," he said, climbing aboard with me. To my surprise, the motor coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. "Thought you said Dad hadn't taken her out in years," I said. "He hadn't," Harold replied, wiping grease from his hands. "But he paid me to maintain her. 5 years in advance. Full service, engine checks, hull scrubbing, electronics updates. Even had the navigation system replaced a couple years back. Said you'd understand when the time came. Told me if you ever talked about selling her, I was supposed to tell you to check everything twice. Something flickered in his eyes as he spoke, like he knew more but wasn't going to spell it out. I spent hours going over every inch of the boat. The deck was sturdier than it looked, the wiring modern and neatly installed, the cabin spotless, like someone had been caring for it with quiet devotion. Behind the captain's chair, the wood paneling seemed off. A thin seam barely visible unless you were searching. The edges were worn smooth, like fingers had pressed against it countless times. I pushed. Nothing. Tried sliding. Nothing. Then I noticed the steering wheel. The varnish on the rim was worn unevenly, especially at the hard left position, like someone had turned it that way again and again. I gripped the wheel and cranked it to port until it stopped. A soft click echoed through the cabin. The panel in the wall shifted open about an inch, revealing a dark space behind it. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pulled it wide. Inside was a black, waterproof container, military-grade. Heavy, built to survive anything. Its lock was a thick combination dial, the kind that didn't give second chances. And then it hit me, the numbers. Not Richard's birthday. Not Mom and Dad's anniversary. Not anything tied to Richard's perfect life. March 21st. My birthday. My fingers trembled as I spun the dial. The final click landed like thunder in my chest. The lock snapped open, the sound sharp and final, echoing through my whole body like Dad was in that cabin with me. Inside the container were manila envelopes bound with a leather strap, a bundle of photographs, and a letter written in my father's unmistakable hand. Steady, deliberate strokes that had signed school permission slips and birthday cards for nearly 4 decades. Daniel, if you're reading this, you've finally taken the wheel. The words blurred before my eyes. I sank into the captain's chair, the one where Dad had spent countless mornings staring at the water like it held answers. My hands shook as I opened the first envelope. It contained incorporation papers for something called Ironwood Infrastructure LLC, dated 1991. The next was a stack of bank statements from an institution I'd never heard of. The balance made my chest lock up. Over $42 million sitting quietly in an account hidden from every will, every family meeting, every conversation. The third envelope was the thickest. Inside were contracts and agreements tied to infrastructure projects spanning half the country. Bridges, highways, treatment plants. I shuffled through them until my pulse began to race. Every major project I had ever worked on was in there. The overpass in Dayton, where I spent months battling concrete pours in the freezing cold. The hospital parking structure in Raleigh, where I earned a reputation for problem solving. The Savannah water facility, where I trained new crews and proved myself more than just a laborer. Each project had been quietly funded, at least in part, by Ironwood. And it wasn't random. My father had kept photographs from every site, some of me with a hard hat on, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up. Photos I didn't even know existed. On each one were notes scrawled in the margins in his careful handwriting. Daniel leading foundation crew. Daniel redesigning drainage. Daniel teaching safety protocols. He'd been watching me my entire career, not with criticism or lectures, but with pride and record-keeping, like he was building a secret ledger of my worth. At the bottom of the container sat another envelope. This one was heavier, marked with a single word, truth. My breath caught as I slid out its contents. Adoption papers dated 1985. My birth certificate, amended. My biological father's name was listed as Thomas Harper, my uncle. The same man who had stood silently at the will reading, who had left the family business decades ago without explanation, who had never once raised his voice against Richard inheriting everything. The room tilted. My father, Charles Harper, hadn't just raised me. He had chosen me, hidden the truth to protect me, to shield me from the gossip and the judgment that would have followed. I unfolded the letter, my father's voice echoing in every line. Son, Richard was always destined for the visible empire, the buildings with our name etched in stone, the properties people talk about at cocktail parties. He thrives on applause, on recognition. That's his nature, and I stopped fighting it long ago. But you, Daniel, are different. You work for the sake of the work. You value sweat, precision, and things that last. That is why the true legacy, the one no one sees, was meant for you. Ironwood infrastructure has been my life's hidden project. While Richard was shaking hands in boardrooms, you were laying the beams that hold this country together. And without ever knowing it, you were building what you already owned. The company now generates over $7 million annually in passive income. All of it is yours. The paperwork has long been in place. You were the beneficiary from the day you picked up your first set of tools. I clutched the adoption papers, my father's words pressing into me like iron. The boat wasn't a slight. It was a test. Would you honor something that seemed worthless? Would you care enough to look closer? Sterling, or Richard, as you know him, got the crown he craved. But you, son, have the foundation. The empire no one applauds, but everyone depends on. The invisible strength that will outlast us all. The last line nearly broke me. Blood doesn't define you. Choice does. I chose you. Now choose what kind of man you'll be. The papers slipped in my hands. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was something else entirely seen. Tucked behind the adoption papers was another letter, this one written in my Uncle Thomas's rough, uneven handwriting. Daniel, your mother and I were reckless once. I was 22, she was 19, and Margaret had already been married to Charles for 2 years. That summer, while Charles was in the hospital recovering from surgery, we made a mistake we could never undo. When you were conceived, the doctors had told Charles he would never father children again. Margaret was broken over it, ready to leave everything behind. But Charles did something I never expected. He chose to raise you as his own. He said, every family needs an heir. Blood doesn't make it real. Choice does. It was the hardest decision of my life signing those papers, but it was also the best. Charles loved you more than you'll ever know. He saw himself in you. Someone who builds things that last, not just things that glitter. The infrastructure business was his way of protecting you. Richard has always been hungry for recognition, desperate to be seen. That pride runs thick in our family, but Charles kept you away from that poison. He wanted you to grow strong without being smothered by comparison. I needed you to know this. Charles was your father in every way that mattered. But I want you to know where you came from. You weren't just his son by choice. You were his chosen successor, the one he trusted with what truly mattered. My hands trembled as I called Mom. My voice cracked like I was a kid again. You knew? All this time. Her voice was steady, almost relieved. We all knew, Daniel. Your father insisted. The moment he held you in that hospital room, you were his son. Biology was just noise. He didn't want you burdened with questions. He wanted you to grow into yourself, not into someone else's shadow. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Because Charles believed that truth carries weight. He wanted you to be strong enough to carry it when the time was right. Every Sunday on that boat, he wasn't just staring at the water. He was writing. He kept journals about you, about your work, your progress, the man you were becoming. He clipped every report that mentioned your name, every commendation, every success. He wanted you to know one day that he'd been watching the whole time. Her words cut deeper than any inheritance could. Richard got the money he could measure. What I had was something greater, proof of a father's devotion, steady and unseen. At the bottom of the case lay one final document, a transfer of ownership for Ironwood infrastructure, dated a week before Dad died. My name already filled the beneficiary line. A yellow sticky note was pressed to the top, my father's shaky script trembling across it. The boat is yours, son. She isn't much to look at, but she holds the truth. Care for what matters. Let Richard have the spotlight. You keep the foundation strong. That's what real builders do. I kept the boat, not as a relic, but as a promise. I restored her board by board, bolt by bolt, until the hull gleamed navy blue with gold trim, just like in the old photographs. It took 3 months, and I worked most nights alone, my hands blistered, my back sore, but I wouldn't have had it any other way. Harold helped when he could, telling me stories as we sanded decks and rewired the lights. Your daddy would sit in this chair for hours, he said one evening, nodding toward the captain's seat. I'd bring him coffee, and he'd be scribbling in that leather journal of his, always looking out at the horizon, like he was seeing something bigger than the rest of us. When we finally rolled her back into the water, reborn and ready, Harold stepped back and smiled through damp eyes. He was seeing you, Daniel. That's what I think. He once told me real wealth isn't what people can see. It's what you build when nobody's watching. Back then, I thought he was talking about the boat. Now I know he was talking about you. Standing on that deck, the waves lapping against the hull, I realized the truth. Richard had inherited fortune. I had inherited faith. And faith, I finally understood, was worth far more than $41 million. I never told Richard about Ironwood infrastructure. Let him chase headlines, host ribbon cuttings, and see his face in glossy business magazines. Every time he boasts at family dinners about another luxury development with the Harper name plastered on the side, I keep quiet. I don't remind him that the water lines feeding it, the parking deck underneath it, the reinforced foundations holding it steady, all belong to me. Ironwood generates income so steady it doesn't need an audience. He lives on applause. I live on results. Uncle Thomas and I meet for coffee every Sunday now, at the same diner on Route 47 where crews have gathered for decades before heading to job sites. He always says the same thing, as though he's making sure I never forget it. Charles raised you right. He leans on that phrase like it's a hymn. Then he shakes his head, smiling crookedly. If it were me, I would have buried Richard in the truth, shown him who really runs the ground he walks on. I sip my black coffee, stirring it the same way Dad used to, and answer, that's the difference between you and him. Dad taught me foundations don't need applause. They just have to hold. On Saturdays, when the marina is quiet, I sometimes take Emily out on the boat. She'll bring her boyfriend along, Timothy, a polite kid who works in his father's hardware store. Last week, Richard rolled in uninvited, revving his new Ferrari so loud it startled the seagulls. He strutted down the dock, talking circles about foreign investments and seven-figure deals, trying to impress the boy with stories of boardrooms and brokerages. After 20 minutes, Timothy looked over at me, hesitant, then asked, "Mr. Harper, what do you do?" Before I could answer, Emily leaned forward, her voice steady and proud. "My dad builds things that last. That's more important than any of that other stuff." She didn't even glance at Richard. She didn't have to. That night, long after everyone left, I found another letter from Dad tucked behind the navigation desk, hidden under the old GPS manual. His handwriting wavered, but the message was strong. "Daniel, success was never about what you were handed. It was about what you could uncover. The boat was never about wood and steel. It was about trust. I trusted you to look closer, to see value where others see waste, to protect what can't be shown off. Richard got the fortune that makes noise. You got the future that makes strength. This boat wasn't your consolation prize. It was my compass, pointing you toward who you are. You're not my second son. You're my anchor, my builder, my true heir." I carry that letter in my wallet now, folded soft at the edges, right beside a photo of me and Dad on the Sea Dreams when I was 5. We both wore matching captain's hats that swallowed our heads whole, but we didn't care. We were grinning like kings. Sometimes Richard calls late at night, bragging about his newest tower or resort. I put him on speaker and guide the boat into the open bay. The sound of the waves drowns out his words until they're nothing but static. That's when I think about Dad, about Thomas, about how one man chose to raise another's son not out of obligation, but out of love. Charles Harper left Richard the fortune that everyone could count, $41 million in buildings and land. He left me a weathered boat that most thought was scrap, a vessel that carried a $43 million secret, and a legacy deeper than steel or concrete. That boat proved I wasn't just his son. I was his partner, his continuation, his foundation, and that's worth more than every skyscraper Richard will ever own.